Good evening. I hope you all are doing well. Welcome to the third webinar of season 11 of the National Humanities Center's Humanities Class Webinar Series. I'm Mike Williams, Vice President for Education Programs here at the NHC. And as always, it is a pleasure, truly an honor to be here with you all. I sincerely hope that you are doing well this evening. I know you all have had busy days. Those of you who aren't tracked out right now, but equally so, I hope things are going well for you all. There are over 1,400 of you registered for tonight's session. The third session of the season is entitled The Victorian History of New Media. Our leader for this session is Dr. Paul Fyfe, NHC Fellow 2018-2019 and Professor of English at North Carolina State University. As always, I want to begin by telling you a little bit about who we are, the National Humanities Center, of course. We are located in Durham, North Carolina, and for 47 years, beginning in 1978, which means we will be celebrating our 50th here soon. We've supported the best in humanities scholarship, humanities education. We are, in fact, the only private nonprofit institution globally devoted exclusively to the study of the humanities. At the center, our education programs, we serve a critical role. We're that nexus between our scholars and educators. Our goal is to build those bridges between your world and the everyday working classroom and the scholarly world. We support educators at all levels, with the large majority being at K-12 level, but of course we have collegiate and graduate level educators who join us as well. I am joined by an outstanding team that includes our program manager, Raven Ferguson, and our digital coordinator, Eve Morris, who are both very passionate about this work and who are committed to our North Star, which is service. And so we want to ensure that you all are taken care of, that we are serving the needs of our teachers throughout the country. I want to take a few moments to update you all on all the happenings at the National Humanities Center. I welcome you to check us out at nationalhumanities.center.org for any updates. From left to right, in the main panel, is our statement in support of the Smithsonian Institution. The National Humanities Center stands firmly in support of the Smithsonian Institution, its administration, and its museum professionals. The Smithsonian is an unparalleled hub of research and education where scholars and professionals work diligently to present accurate, evidence-based accounts of our shared history, including its painful and difficult aspects. These institutions offer spaces of learning and discovery for all Americans, aiming to help us understand our past without imposing a predetermined interpretation. Respecting the independence of research-based institutes and the expertise of professionals is fundamental to humanistic practices. The Smithsonian has already committed to conducting its own internal review and adhering to established scholarly standards. The Smithsonian must be allowed to fulfill its mission without fear of political backlash or ideological pressure. In the center panel, become a fellow at the National Humanities Center's. Applications for the 26-27 fellowship are now open. Conceived with the needs of humanists in mind, the National Humanities Center provides scholars with an environment and resources conducive to generating new knowledge and furthering understanding of the human experience. And then lastly, you all are here for the 25-26 Humanities in Class webinar series. These are live interactive webinars that connect you all with scholars and experts in the humanities fields to discuss compelling topics. All right. Of course, I am joined by a strong and talented teacher advisory council. Two of the current members of the council are here tonight, and you see them. They're both very active in the chat. What's up to my friends Mike Burns and Trey Smith, who you'll see active in the chat this evening as well, serving as TAs. But our Teacher Advisory Council, they're a team of educators across the country who give us feedback and consult with us on various projects. Last week, we held our annual retreat where members of this year's TAC joined us at the NHC, and we had a great time. So for those of you all who are listening, thank you so much. This year's council includes teachers who have experience with educators of multiple levels who have experience with various areas of our programming, including webinar attendees, online course participants, and former institute participants as well. If you or any of your friends are interested in checking out recordings of past webinars, please navigate to our webinars landing page and follow the webinar archives link to our dedicated YouTube page. Once you're there, you're going to find all of our past recordings that have been updated up to our last webinar last week. As always, I have to let you all know that viewings of past recordings are not eligible for CEU and or professional development hours. You have to be here in order to receive those professional development hours or certification for those professional development hours. As a matter of housekeeping, just to let you all know, tonight's webinar is audio and PowerPoint based. So you will not see Paul directly, but you'll be able to interact with the both of us through the chat box. You all are doing a great job using the audience chat right now. So you have the audience chat where you can interact among each other. And the other is the Q&A chat box. So if you have any questions whatsoever for our speaker, please enter them in the Q&A chat, and I will be monitoring those questions, and I will bring them to him at the appropriate time throughout the presentation. Thank you for joining us this evening. You are attending the webinar entitled The Victorian History of New Media. Our leader for this session is Paul Fyfe, NHC Fellow, 2018-2019, Professor of English and Director of the Graduate Certificate in Digital Humanities, North Carolina State University. I'm also joined by two members of our Teacher Advisory Council, Mike Burns and Trey Smith. Thank you for being here tonight, gentlemen. Dr. Paul Fyfe's research and teaching include British Victorian literature, 19th century book and media history, digital humanities, and artificial intelligence. His latest book is called Digital Victorians, a long history of digital humanities based in 19th century media cultures. As a co-PI on NC State Center for Artificial Intelligence and Society and Ethics, he focuses on the ethics of language models. He also works with colleagues on using multimodal AI on the analysis and discovery of 19th century illustrated newspapers. Previous digital research projects have included oceanic exchanges, which tracked information flow across international 19th century newspaper networks, illustrated image analytics, which experimented with how computer vision can search and sort Victorian periodical illustrations, speech across dialects of English, with colleagues in linguistics, and Victoria's Lost Pavilion, which virtually reconstructed Queen Victoria's Garden Pavilion as a three-dimensional model. At NC State, he is also part of the CRDM PhD program, the Visual Narrative Interdisciplinary Cluster, and the Graduate Certificate in Digital Humanities. Dr. Fyfe teaches a variety of undergraduate and graduate courses in English department and first-year seminars in the university's honors program. These courses cover British Victorian literature, for example, the Victorian Survey, major British authors, the 19th century novel, or else bridge that literature with contemporary culture. For example, Victorian media studies, reading in the digital age, introduction to digital humanities. When possible, these courses offer hands-on experiences in historical and contemporary text technologies, such as bookbinding, learning to sew book bindings, developing research projects on humanities data sets, or trying critical making projects in the NCSU Library's maker space. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you. It always brings a smile to our face whenever we are able to connect with our former fellows. And of course, you are in the neighborhood, right in the triangle with us. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your talk.
Thanks so much, Mike. Go Pack. And I'm just delighted to see everybody here. Thank you so much for taking the time. And also, if you did the homework, good for you. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the book that came out of my time at the National Humanities Center while an ACLS Burkhardt Fellow called Digital Victorians, which in its anachronistic title basically explains my split personality as a scholar. British Victorian literature on the one hand and digital media on the other. So in the book, I try to argue for a connection between them, tracing the roots of the digital well before computers and finding them instead within the 19th century media landscape. But I'm certainly not the first to notice the correspondences between past and present. The recommended readings included a couple examples of other writers and scholars that I've taken inspiration from. For example, Tom Standage's popular history, The Victorian Internet, which directly compares a 19th century telegraph network to modern computers and the internet. As Standage writes, quote, "The equipment may have been different, but the telegraph's impact on the lives of its users was strikingly similar." In more scholarly work, I've been inspired by Carolyn Marvin's important social history when old technologies were new. Marvin makes some really bold claims that new media is not new. Instead, quote, "All the communication inventions in between the telegraph and the computer have simply been elaborations on the telegraph's original work." And even further, quote, "All debates about electronic media in the 20th century begin here." Or, as the media studies scholar John Durham Peters puts it, the history of new media is old. And we should acknowledge that new media is probably older than the 19th century. But wow, in that time, folks really felt like something monumental was changing. The 19th century witnessed massive changes in telecommunications infrastructure and technologies, including the railway, steamships, the industrialization of printing, the mass image, telegraphy, photography, phonography, radio, and so on. The 19th century's new media essentially blew the Victorians' minds. To get a sense of this, here's a brief quotation from an article from the Westminster Review reviewing the decade of the 1830s. Quote, "The annihilation of space and time is beginning to be no fable. The broad Atlantic has been bridged by steam navigation. The electric spark has been seized and made to obey the impulse of the human will. Lightning is our news carrier. Light is our portrait painter. Time and space annihilated. Electricity, lightning, light itself, they all seem to have taken over human communication. And it wasn't just the technology that was new. It was the feeling that things were changing so dramatically. And that's a feeling I bet many of us have also had or are currently having. At least that's how I felt when I was in my 20s. In college, getting email for the first time and a Netscape 1.0 web browser. After that, I had a whiplash experience of old to new media in my first proper jobs. Out of college, I started at a publishing company, W.W. Norton in New York, which was very much old media. The compositors there were still in the late 90s, cutting and pasting with X-Acto knives and glue onto cardboard to get galleys ready for camera copy. This was the website from the time I worked there, thanks to the Internet Archive, with its cheesy spiral-bound notebook theme emphasizing the point. But after hemorrhaging money for about a year, I moved from old media to new media, getting a job at the now defunct About.com. In 1999, the .com bubble was full to bursting, and, quote, new media companies were disrupting everything they could think of. It was a heady time, but the bubble burst. I got laid off, and without a job, I did what you do and you go back to grad school. I went to the University of Virginia, where other new things were happening. Humanities departments and libraries were experimenting with new media themselves, making electronic texts and digital archives, and thinking about how digitization and computation might change scholarly practice in the humanities. And this, I'm just sharing an example of one of the projects I worked on from that time, a digital archive of the pre-Raphaelite poet and painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti. During the time I was in graduate school, activities like these would get a name, Digital Humanities, first articulated in 2004 in the title of a Blackwell volume called, quote, A Companion to Digital Humanities. By 2009, Digital Humanities was declared the next big thing in higher education. It was all happening. It was so hot right now. It was all strange and new. However, because I was also studying century British literature at the same time, I recognized that this sense of a media revolution had happened before. 19th century media shifts compelled the Victorians to declare that they too were living in unprecedented times. As John Stuart Mill famously declared in 1831, quote, the first of the leading peculiarities of the present age is that it is an age of transition. That was one of two epigraphs I use in my book. The second is by the Romanticist and digital humanities scholar Alan Liu. New media are old, and old media are new. The story of new media is older than we think. As I did the research for this book, more and more correspondences between then and now kept coming up. For instance, here is a contemporary academic book called Rethinking Media Change. The editors use Mill's quotation to introduce their own preoccupations with digital media. And it's tiny. I'm going to read it for you. The first lines of their volume. Quote, set aside the 19th century tonalities, and this passage, they're referring to Mill's quote, could belong to our own era. Its apocalyptic rhetoric and its self-conscious awareness of change closely mirror the discourse of the so-called digital revolution. And it's really this self-consciousness about new media, not necessarily the technology, that I got really interested in. Digital technologies have a 19th century history, but perhaps more interestingly, the very ways we think about new media also have pre-computational histories, many of which can be found in that self-conscious awareness of change. This is why I don't study the history of technology exactly, but rather how people represented and responded to the new media of their day. Alan Liu calls this the new media encounter. It's a discursive moment in which new media gets theorized in contrast to what comes before. And so the book, Digital Victorians, essentially follows this line of thinking, looking to the past to understand how we get to the present. And I just wanted to kind of call out, this is the TLDR version of the book, some of what I hope it contributes. First, offering a history of the new media encounter from Victorian print and telecommunications technologies all the way to the digital present. Also, charting genealogies for what I think are durable Victorian concepts, some of which I'll talk about today, including digital immateriality, network surveillance, permanent memory, quantitative analysis, machine reading, and the monstrous threats of digital researchers to academic norms. Finally, I hope my book offers stories about how we get to now, including the transmission of archives and texts and the formation of disciplinary fields. But why do this? So what? That greatest of all critical questions. Well, I think it matters in a couple of ways, particularly in context of reaching students who are completely immersed in their own seemingly revolutionary media environments. These histories help us all push back on the, quote, new, the disruptive, the revolutionary rhetoric that it's all changing. This rhetoric often serves commercial interests, more claims of marketers than anything. I think these histories also help us identify how we understand, and just as importantly, how we misunderstand our own new media situation. I think that learning these histories may help us to imagine alternatives to our own present situation. They may help us dislodge the present as a given and maybe imagine other futures. Historical thinking is key to future imagining. Finally, for me, at a STEM school like NC State, it emphasizes the role of literature in shaping the socio-technical imagination. So, before we get into some of these details, I just want to pause here and check in with the audience, see how folks are doing, if there are any urgent questions that you want to answer from here. Mike?
No, all right, good deal. Thank you. And I encourage everyone, if you should have any questions of Paul, please enter them in the Q&A chat. I see the conversation is moving along, so please enter your questions there, and I'll bring them to his attention at the appropriate time. Paul, one question we have, and maybe you'll get into this a little bit more, really interested in the public's initial reactions, whether it's excitement or a sense of anxiousness to the emergence of new media, particularly during the Victorian age. And I know that may be a little broad, but I know, having grown up in the MTV, hip hop generation, you tend to have, the teens and the young adults who are gravitating to these technologies. Can you speak to just the emergence of new media and maybe the public's reception of it?
Well, I think that's exactly the thing that I'm really interested in, and what we're at a particularly good place to do this kind of work, because we all sort of feel it, but because it's also hard to sort of analyze our own present as a historical moment, right? The present is historical. We just are too close to it to get critical distance. So it helps to look back to the past for analogous situations that we can use, not necessarily to decode everything that's going on. Of course, there are going to be differences, but to use that comparison and contrast to get a little distance from ourselves and think about it in other ways.
Good deal. Thank you. Thank you so much. Again, if anyone should have any questions, we will make time for those questions. And Paul, we can move ahead. And when additional questions come up, I'll make sure I bring them to your attention.
All right. So I'm going to share with you a couple examples that I talk about in the book to come, in which I'm trying to use 19th century literature and its technological landscape to identify some durable Victorian ways of thinking about new media. I will admit you may not be familiar with some of the works I discuss, but I want to just highlight there are lots of other texts that also provide opportunities to engage students with a longer history of new media. I'm just throwing out a few of my favorite 19th century examples here. And I'll also say that teaching courses in science fiction, which has its own roots in the 19th century, also has helped me engage these topics with students. For the rest of the time, though, I'm going to talk to you about materials from a chapter from the book about how Victorian literature sketches some of the foundational paradoxes of digital connection and memory. I'm going to concentrate on 3 of these paradoxes, and I hope that you may also recognize them as conditions of our present era. That is, the more we're connected, the more we're alone. That's the first paradox. Second, the more information we have, the less we seem to be able to function. And finally, how digital memory seems somehow both like it will last forever while being totally fragile and ephemeral. Now, I want to underscore here that these conditions do not arise from digital technology. Rather, they are the legacies of how earlier writers understood their radically changing technological and information landscape. For the sake of clarity, I've made this little chart. We could map these perceptions onto specific changes in the media landscape. For example, the connectedness seemingly promised by emerging networks of railways, telegraphs, and the information that circulated through them and seemed to annihilate space and time. We could look to the superabundance of that information as print was industrialized, produced at unprecedented scales, especially with periodicals and newspapers. And we could trace this to the emergence of new recording technologies like photography, or later phonography, and then film. However, there's a risk in making these seem like they come from technological phenomena. I want to emphasize that technologies do not make history. The previous slide oversimplifies things for clarity, but Lisa Gittleman, one of my scholarly heroes, reminds us that media are, quote, socially realized structures of communication, where structures include both technological forms and their associated protocols, and where communication is a cultural practice, a ritualized collocation of different people on the same mental map, sharing or engaged with popular ontologies of representation. Now, there's some big terms there. I just want to underline a few key terms that remind us how technology is a construction. It's social, it's cultural, it relates to representations made by people. Some scholars use the term socio-technical imaginary, which insists on the combination of its three components. You cannot take technology away from how it gets imagined, reimagined, and socially implemented. It's a useful way of talking about science fiction, as well as the vitality of literature in general, as literature does not merely reflect a technological history, but it helps feel out and map its edges. It shapes that history. Off my soapbox and on to an example. This is one of the most famous novelists of the Victorian era, who, until the year 1859, had remained anonymous, or pseudonymous, behind the pen name George Eliot. This author had early success with novels including Scenes of Clerical Life and Adam Bede, and everybody was getting curious about who the author really was. In 1859, the secret came out that George Eliot was actually Marian Evans. We still know her as George Eliot, but Marian Evans really wanted to keep her privacy, not least to avoid public scrutiny of her ongoing relationship with George Henry Lewis, who was technically still married. In today's terms, Eliot was doxxed. Now, that term is an anachronism, but it helps signal how this episode relates to questions about connectivity, knowledge, and privacy that still pertain. And Eliot was pissed off about it. In a letter to a friend afterwards, she wrote, quote, "Such annoyances become more intolerable as the years bring with them that increased facility of communication which makes the conjectures and inferences of local ignorance matter for current circulation throughout the kingdom. I only wish I could write something that would contribute to heighten men's reverence before the secrets of each other's souls, that there might be less assumption of entire knowingness as a datum from which inferences are to be drawn." Now, that's a lot. Underlined two parts of the passage that help explain why Eliot is annoyed. That the increased facility of communication makes people assume they can know everything. The communications network seems to promise that we can know everything. But what if the opposite is true? That same year, 1859, Eliot also publishes a curious short novel called The Lifted Veil, which essentially tests out what happens when someone becomes thoroughly connected to an information network. It's a Gothic story. The narrator, his name is Latimer, has supernatural powers, an ability to see into the future, as well as clairvoyance into the minds of others. Arguably, these powers symbolize that, in network terms, he is very online. What's interesting about The Lifted Veil is how it does not fit with Eliot's other works. not only because of the supernatural themes, but because Eliot in her other novels seems so invested in sympathy, in the ethics of knowing and understanding others. The Lifted Veil is instead a perverse experiment on sympathy in an information age. What happens if we immediately know everything about everyone all the time? The scholar Laura Otis has argued that, quote, in Eliot's eyes, one fostered sympathy through knowledge and experience of others, and England's new communications networks offered both. But it's pretty evident from the text that Eliot is thinking about Victorian communication networks and media technologies. The Lifted Veil references the telegraph, the magic lantern, early photography, and turns them all into Latimer's powers of telepathy. And here's the interesting thing. Latimer actually experiences the opposite of what Laura Otis here predicts. The more connections he has, the more isolated and paralyzed he becomes. In Latimer's words, quote, this strange new power might rather be a disease. We can recognize that disease now as the cognitive and emotional paralysis of information overload. So, the historian Anne Blair points out that information overload has a long history. In her excellent book, Too Much to Know, she points out that anytime new technologies emerge, people freak out in similar ways. And in his book, Overwhelmed, the scholar of American literature, Maurice Lee, has connected this directly with the 19th century's proliferation of text, image, and information. But I think Eliot is doing something a little different. She illustrates the deeply problematic confusion of communication networks with knowledge. The Lifted Veil exposes the very ideology of networked communication, an assumption that such networks establish social connections at all. And here I'm sharing with you some early marketing copy from Facebook. Quote, the more we connect, the better it gets. What if the opposite was true? Eliot's story shows the problems of the network as a way of knowing or relating to others. Eliot lived this experience in 1859, exposed by a network that invaded her privacy and alienated her from readers. And we are living versions of it now. In her work on selfhood, socialization, and digital networks, the psychologist and technology researcher Sherry Turkle has arrived at a version of the Lifted Veil's paradox. Quote, we are increasingly connected to each other, but oddly more alone. Now, as Turkle says, technology proposes itself as the architect of our intimacies. But those technologized intimacies are poor substitutes, offering only the efficiencies of connection in place of healthier relationships, which, in Turkle's view as a psychologist, are grounded in empathy. Now, even though we, admittedly, are connecting through technology that I'm critiquing, you are not alone. So again, I want to just pause here and check in with the group. How are we doing? How are people taking this on board? What's coming to your mind? Mike?
Good deal. Thank you all. And again, I'm looking at the audience chat. Thank you all for your comments and your reflections and resources, et cetera. Morel had a question pretty early on. Her question is, could McLuhan's "the media is the message" be to blame for displacement of reasons for changes in society being placed on media instead of attributing the societal changes on human beings? McLuhan? Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I think what McLuhan, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is a media studies scholar and really important to the founding of that discipline. One thing he really wanted to do was to simplify things a great deal, to call attention to something he thought was missing, which was how, implicit in his most famous expression, the medium is the message, how media actively shapes the messages it conveys. This was extremely important to do in the middle 20th century and in the kind of conversion to a television mass media that McLuhan was interested in. However, it does also risk what folks call technological determinism, which is moving agency away from humans towards the kind of technology that establish our socio-historical condition. Now, there are benefits to taking that view on. So, for example, when I teach something like book history, I probably do overemphasize the way that those materials matter in how they shape the kind of meaning of a text. But that's kind of a heuristic or a way to help people see what has become almost transparent, right? And this is where we also need to entertain the other view, a sort of social history of technology that Carolyn Marvin is doing, or a version of it that Lisa Gittleman is doing, in thinking about the more complex relationships among the affordances of technologies, as well as the social, historical, and material conditions in which people imagine and debate their uses.
Good deal. Thank you for that. We have another question from Mike. Mike, he writes, I wonder if Paul could speak to similarities between the Victorian age and today's society in regards to political and economic power consolidating around those who control the new technologies.
That's a great question. So there are some ways that, and much to my relief, that Victorian politics do not overlay ours. Right? It's all a muddle, as one of Dickens' characters in Hard Times says. However, there are genealogies that are really useful, and certainly we see in thinking about newspaper histories that newspapers were never invented as organs of neutrality or objective reporting. Like, that had to be invented as a function for newspapers, right? They're originally party engines, not shy about leaning into their goals, and probably often financed in order to convey, Whiggish, Tory, liberals kind of or radical viewpoints. Similarly, you'll also see in the Victorian era the political importance of unlicensed media, including newspapers that didn't pay the required taxes, the unstamped press, especially around times in the early part of the century, where essentially everybody in Victorian Britain was waiting for them to have their own revolution. That the press, the unstamped press, the radical press, was very active in that climate. So I think there are a lot of interesting lessons here, although in terms of direct connections to our contemporary media situation, a little tougher. If you want an interesting take on this, I would recommend, there's a book called The Master Switch by Tim Wu that talks about consolidation in communications media, that there is a kind of pattern that Wu traces where some kind of interesting new disruptive communications technology comes out. It's used by a lot of amateurs in unexpected situations, and is gradually subject to ownership and then consolidation of that ownership by larger and larger conglomerates. So that's, I think, maybe a good place to start in looking more deeply into that interesting question.
Okay. And thank you for answering those questions. I dropped a copy of Tim Wu's, we'll drop the link to the URL to the Master Switch for anyone who's interested in taking a look at it. Early on, I also included a link to Paul's book, as well as the promo code, which I will drop again, where you can receive 20% off of that book as well. So, Paul, we're going to move ahead. And if you have any additional questions, please enter them in the chat. I see a few others that will come in that we will circle back and answer a little bit later. Thank you.
All right, so I'm gonna change examples here in order to expand George Eliot's concerns about information networks to what happens when they also capture, record, and keep that information, moving from connection to memory. Victorian novelists were also concerned with how memory was being technologized, especially in the guise of recording devices or inscriptive media. The fancy word for this is memnotectics, and I've probably never said that term right in my life, but there it is. With Latimer in The Lifted Veil, we see the problem of an all-knowing, hyper-connected subject. But Victorian authors also wondered what objects or environments might know about us. This is also the world we live in, a world of extensive data capture from personal devices, internet trackers, electronic payments, smart vehicles, surveillance cameras, and on and on. A world of almost ubiquitous surveillance. The Victorians had an early sense of this, but they explored it in a different context, not in terms of technology, but spiritualism. As Geoffrey Sconce argued in his book Haunted Media, quote, many of our contemporary narratives concerning the powers of electronic telecommunications have, if not their origin, then their first significant cultural synthesis in the doctrines of spiritualism. And there is a lively interchange in the late 19th century between thinking about media on the one hand and spiritual or cult contact on the other. Basically, as soon as telecommunication puts people in contact with others they cannot see, Victorians start wondering about contacting the great beyond, about electricity as a spiritual conduit, or about communicating directly between brains. Spiritualism and the supernatural offered the Victorians a proxy language for thinking about communications media and vice versa. The very term medium, for example, functions in both realms. So, remember that letter I quoted earlier when George Eliot wrote to her friend in 1859? The recipient was Charles Bray, this guy, who 7 years later published a book about spiritualism. Like others at the time, Bray was trying to resolve science and souls, refusing to let them split into two different realms of experience. So Bray hypothesizes some kind of invisible ether or spiritual force that connected everything together. Mind is in connection with all other mind, Bray wrote. This sounds like distributed telepathy, like a network. But what's different here is Bray's attention to environments, not just people. Quote, we influence everyone and everything about us and are influenced by them. We photograph our mental states on all the rooms we inhabit. Charles Babbage is better known as one of the inventors of the computer, but he got into this game too. In a chapter in his 9th Bridgewater treatise, also attempting to resolve reason with religion, he wrote about the permanent impression of our words and actions on the globe we inhabit. Babbage imagines the durability of sound waves inscribed upon the air and later potentially decodable by a supreme mathematical intelligence. Quote, the air itself is one vast library on whose pages are forever written all that man has ever said or woman whispered. Note that people don't get a choice in the matter. Their environments seem to capture everything, all the time, forever. Uh-oh. In 1891, the novelist George du Maurier published a strange novel called Peter Ibbotson that explores these ideas as well as their unnerving consequences. In my book, I show how this novel and Victorian spiritualist discourse forecast the ways we tend to talk about digital memory. So let me just give you a quick glimpse of the story in brief. The title character, Peter Ibbotson, grows up, commits a crime, gets thrown into an asylum, and while he's locked up, somehow develops psychic powers in partnership with his lifelong crush, Mary. That's it. Mary becomes his spiritual guru, teaching Peter how to, quote, dream true. And together, they share a psychic dimension where they start visiting all the scenes of their past in memory. So in a weird way, the story actually works like a conventional Victorian autobiography, as the narrator recounts his life and revisits scenes from his youth through this psychic dream travel. But there's something even stranger going on. Peter realizes that his memory captured so much more detail than he ever paid attention to. In this psychic dream world, he can recover every peripheral thing, sense, sound that he didn't even notice in real life. It's not so much that Peter has a photographic memory, he has ambient memory. The novel struggles to explain this in terms of media. Quote, every word that passed through his inattentive ears into his otherwise preoccupied little brain had been recorded there as in a phonograph. That's a record player, FYI. But late Victorian media really can't even do the job for what Du Maurier is imagining. Consider the struggle in this sentence. Quote, evidently our brain contains something akin both to a photographic plate and a phonographic cylinder, and many other things of the same kind not yet discovered. Hand wave, hand wave, hand wave. Photographs, phonographs are useful metaphors, but can't fully capture the significance of what Du Maurier is imagining. Here again, we can borrow from contemporary ideas about information overload to help explain the past. Malcolm McCullough is a professor of architecture, and in this book, he proposes that, quote, in an age of unprecedented distraction, his words, interface designers and users alike need strategies for accessing, quote, everything you are aware of that didn't consume your attention and that could be brought to the center of focus if necessary. According to McCullough, we need to learn how to manage all the things in our cognitive periphery, or what is ambient. As McCullough points out, this also includes reckoning with how thinking itself happens beyond the brain. Thinking is embodied and environmentally extended, as in the growing field of research into extended cognition. We think with environments, and perhaps they think with us. Peter Ibbotson draws psychic power as he learns to access his ambient memory, or the penumbra of passing impressions, or even how to access a memory that inheres in other people, places, and things. As the novel proceeds, Peter's dream world starts to stretch beyond even his lived experiences. The novel plays a neat trick, making memory transferable from other people dreaming alongside. It's like the character Neo in The Matrix, who, facing his limits in the simulation, just downloads into his brain some martial arts skills or the ability to pilot a helicopter. Same with Peter, who need merely touch hands with his psychic girlfriend Mary to infuse her memories into his own. He calls this a transfusion of identity, or a magical circuit that connects them totally, seeming to offer the ultimate form of sympathy, shared feeling, and telepathic intimacy. However, Peter cannot help reflecting that this, quote, double dream common to us both means full access to each other's minds. Quote, every thought she ever had from her childhood to her death has been revealed. Every thought of mine. In The Lifted Veil, Latimer struggled with omniscience in real time, but in Peter Ibbotson, the narrator is overwhelmed by the total transfusion of mental history, the fire hose of someone's ambient experiences that even they might not consciously remember. Toward the end of the novel, Mary dies, but happily, she soon returns from the great electric beyond to visit Peter with a message. Nothing is lost. Nothing. Spirit Mary is elated that even after death, we, with all our memories and loves, will endure in the permanent memory of the ether. But Peter sees the other side of the coin. Mary's message that nothing is lost also offers a poignant warning in life, as every thought, every action, every dimension of your mental experience will join the ambient commons. Memory is not only ambient, but permanent. Surveillance is total and forever. The novel Peter Ibbotson has an uncanny resonance in our own day. Its visions and anxieties about permanent memory have reappeared in reactions to the internet and social media. Sherry Turkle says, everything you say online is kept forever. The law professor Jeffrey Rosen has argued that, quote, the web means the end of forgetting. Or, according to Victor Meyer-Schoenberger, a professor at the Oxford Internet Institute, the web promises, quote, perfect remembering. For optimists, this seems like a good thing. Digital services allow for the outsourced mind, according to David Brooks, who writes, quote, memory, I have externalized it. Personal information, I have externalized it. Brooks seems delighted to live in a world where, quote, a world where the internet records everything and forgets nothing. But there's another side to this story, the alienation we feel from a digital persona beyond our control. And as with their Victorian spiritualist forebears talking about the ether, these very claims about permanent digital memory are a fantasy. They imagine a durable and intangible medium that does not exist. As the computer scientist Jeff Rothenberg quipped, digital documents last forever, or 5 years, whichever comes first. Furthermore, the arguments about permanent digital memory confuse digital storage with the messy realities of preservation, the labor, the care, the investment required to keep things through time. It doesn't happen by itself. And they're further contradicted by other recent arguments that say exactly the opposite, that the web is forgetting all the time, that digital files are nightmarishly ephemeral. Meyer-Schoenberger claims that in the web era, forgetting has become the exception and remembering the default. But other scholars have warned the exact opposite, about a digital dark ages in which we are, by default, not keeping but losing entire swaths of born digital records. In fact, the blind faith in durable, permanent digital memory actually produces its opposite, a lack of awareness, concern, and investment to curate precarious digital materials for even the near future. As the media scholar Wendy Chun has pointed out, storage is a thing, but memory is a commitment. Digital memory has reanimated a surprising amount of Victorian thinking, including about contacting the dead. As Microsoft researcher Gordon Bell once promised about e-memory, quote, you will have virtual immortality. Some companies now, like this one, Rememory, promise your enduring connections to loved ones after death, reanimated in text, speech, image, video, or hologram by AI trained on their life's data. These days, some people think they're talking to God through ChatGPT. In the cloud, our data becomes sublime, and it produces uncanniness of its own. As media studies scholar Grant Bulmer hauntingly suggests, quote, there is no real way to distinguish between the living and the dead online. We're living in an era of contradictory thinking about digital memory, which, I'm arguing, shows the durability of Victorian ideas about new media. But perhaps we can also look to the past for inspiration about how to deal with our alienated condition, which is perhaps not so new after all. So by way of closing, I want to suggest how the Victorians may also have developed a kind of data ethics for their time, an ethics ironically grounded in knowing less about other people. If the lifted veil figures the moral paralysis of information overload, it also begins to suggest an ethics of forgetfulness, developed more fully in some of George Eliot's other novels. Here is maybe the most often quoted line from her most famous book, Middlemarch. Quote, "If we had a keen vision and feeling of all ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heartbeat, and we should die of that roar which lies on the other side of silence." The character of Latimer in The Lifted Veil gets stripped of this insulation and knows too much. But Eliot knows this is not an individual problem, but a social one. And here's the second most quoted line from Middlemarch, coming at the very end of that novel. Quote, "The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs." We can link this philosophy with Eliot's wish in 1859, not just for privacy, but to cultivate what she said in that letter, quote, "reverence before the secrets of each other's souls." Eliot wants to find a balance. She recognizes the need for social connectedness with an ethics of privacy, limited attention, not knowing, or what today gets called the right to be forgotten. In the chapter for my book, I connect these Victorian examples further throughout the 20th century to the landmark legal essay, The Right to Privacy by Warren and Brandeis, and then later to critiques of data surveillance, the right to delist or take down information on the internet, and data privacy frameworks. In other words, to imagine how Victorian enduring ideas about data ethics are there as well. The goal is partly to offer a longer history of the digital, to realize that, quote, "new media are old," and to find out where many of our ideas about new media come from. Doing so may help us understand and thrive within another historical era of massive technological change. The history of Victorian new media offers us lessons in the complexity of responding socially to technological change. So thanks very much. At this point, I'd be delighted to hear more of your thoughts, your questions, and use our time remaining for chats. Mike?
Good deal. And thank you all so much. First question that we have. I wonder about the end of forgetting. I mean, when technologies become obsolete, example, floppy disks, VHS, et cetera, good list, Morel. Don't we lose some content? When technologies become obsolete, don't we lose some content? I wonder about the end of forgetting, that question.
Very much so. And this is exactly the risk that comes along with thinking that everything you say online is kept forever, right? Now, I have two boys in high school, and I understand the value in the short term of that way of thinking, right? In terms of teaching kids information literacy and online safety, etc. However, as Wendy Chun argues, the downstream consequences of that mythology is that we forget our storage technologies also get old, right? That they also have to be cared for and migrated. And this is where she makes the distinction between storage technologies and the phenomenon of memory, right? So I think we need to understand that we have an obligation to care for for the digital, to maybe also treat some things as far less durable than we would like to think, and that's also a pain. In fact, the one of the guys who was involved in kind of inventing the internet, so to speak, Vint Cerf, is very active in trying to imagine and then create a more kind of permanent digital preservation infrastructure that he calls digital vellum, right? So vellum is like parchment. It's basically what Harry Potter and friends wrote on, but that's entirely ridiculous because parchment was the skin of animals, and they would never be doing their homework on it. It was super expensive, labor intensive, and has proven shockingly durable, even especially in contrast to paper. So we have things that have been around for a long time. I mean, even the metaphor of like written in stone, right, calls our attention back to the material substrates that we depend on for the permanence of writing. But now the durability of those substrates is has a shockingly short half-life. And no one has totally figured out how to effectively migrate and curate materials across changes in inscriptive technology, because there are major technological problems. There's also infrastructure problems, right? Like that is boring, right? There's not money for keeping stuff, right? There's money for new things and disruptive things in technology, less investment for preservation. And our colleagues in libraries and archives are profoundly aware of these risks.
All right. Another question we have for you, if you could speak to how did Victorian educators, institutions, whether it's libraries or schools, how did they respond to the influx of new information and media formats? Were there specific approaches or methods that they developed to help people manage the shift in literacy skills?
What an interesting question, and I will admit up front that I don't necessarily know the historical context about education, but what that question brings to mind are a couple of examples. The engine of information overload in the 19th century was the periodical press. So with the Industrial Revolution, steam power also came to printing, and the first things printed by steam were newspapers and then later periodicals, which were not one-time things, right? Some came out every day or like every couple days or every week or every month. So suddenly the periodical press produced a voluminous sense of too much information, and there was a century-long struggle for what to do about it, for how to deal with it. And a few things happened. One is the kind of modern book review, right? So much is getting printed that you need a secondary information layer to understand what is worth your time, what to notice, what not to notice. Similar to that, there were like kind of Reader's Digests in a way, culminating to the point where by the end of the century, you just had a newspaper called Titbits that was just like tweets, right, of tiny little snippets that they copied and pasted from all kinds of different sources. And then you also had libraries like the British Library that were struggling to themselves figure out what do we keep and how do we deal with all this. So the last chapter in my book, and sorry for the plug, does give a kind of history of how the British Library, which was the British Museum at the time, tried to deal with the explosion of materials they were supposed to be responsible for indexing and presenting to readers. And there was constant struggles to make indexes, bibliographies, etc. The other thing that this brings to mind, which is something I write about elsewhere in the book, was the invention of speed reading, which comes and speed writing technologies or techniques like shorthand. Shorthand becomes really prominent in the 19th century. Charles Dickens learned and wrote in shorthand to report. It becomes a distributed employment opportunity for a lot of new folks in the workforce, including women. And along with shorthand, there was speed reading, which taught people to try, and be able to get through things faster. So I guess to sort of sum up, there are two responses to information overload that I was kind of seeing and writing about. One is like indexing and producing another information layer to navigate that, and the other is speed writing, speed reading, doing it faster and more efficiently. And how this plays out in schools is still a really interesting question, and I thank you for that, and I want to look into it more.
No problem. Thank you for your response. Another question, who among contemporary writers, both fiction or nonfiction, would you recommend for insights on the issues of new media in our world today? Any contemporary writers who you would recommend?
Well, I haven't read anything published after 1900, so I'm no help. That's a really good question. So I tried to share some of the perspectives that I found useful, not all of which I would necessarily endorse, right? Sherry Turkle is a very useful perspective, but there are also interesting counter arguments to Turkle, and one that I would recommend is Dana Boyd, DANAH BOYD, all lowercase, who writes about essentially teenagers in the social media era and trying to understand from her research what's going on there. But the writing is absolutely voluminous, and also what's interesting is how much people's preoccupations have turned towards machine learning and AI as an entirely new set of problems. Essentially, my book kind of self-consciously stops with AI, and Mike, when you invite me back to the National Humanities Center, I'll have another book about the prehistory of AI. So
looking forward to it.
But it's a fascinating question, and I'll continue to ruminate on that and think about kind of narratives and information overload in the present, and who's kind of writing about them and imagining them, etc.
Okay. Another question we have. We're all aware of the anxiety around disinformation, fake news, and people only trusting their own sources. When the Victorian press, when it took off with cheap, fast newspapers, did people have similar trust issues, as best you understand? Just drawing a comparison of the two.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, like the history of newspapers, the whole notion of journalistic objectivity arrives late relative to the history of newspapers. The marketing of increasingly niche kinds of periodicals is really notable across the Victorian context, where you have the emergence and development of a really vibrant regional and provincial press, even though the kind of metropolitan papers get all the attention. You have the development of local and regional presses in a more global context when we think about Victorian Britain, in terms of the kind of colonial context they had, and English and foreign language periodicals in India, specializing, subspecializing. So you had trade periodicals, everything from teetotaling clubs to things devoted to different kind of workmen and labor. So there was that hyper segmentation of reading markets that attended the explosion of the press. The other part of this question is about its ingenuity or disingenuity, right? Which is, okay, when does that become a problem? And we in fact have seen examples of people exploiting the 19th century news network for political ends. So the whole history of fake news, some folks have also traced back to a really infamous 19th century context. And there's one that's kind of infamous and close to home here in North Carolina about the Wilmington riots, the only successful coup in American history, that was fomented by intentionally planted fake news about the threats of sexual violence from Black men by white newspaper owners who were absolutely refusing to accept the election results that put Black men into politics in Wilmington. So it is a really shocking and unfortunately seemingly a contemporary feeling example of the intentional manipulation of a kind of hyper-connected news network to plant rapidly circulating disinformation for political ends. So that has a history as well.
Good deal. Thank you. Thank you so much. Another question. Again, thank you all for the questions that you're entering into the chat. And Morel, thank you for your questions. She's another. Could Paul comment on the juxtaposition of the idea of quote unquote new, parens, an economy of planned obsolescence and disposable products, with the idea of needing to practice conservation to make less harmful impact on the environment? Is this a field of study that you're aware of? And if so, do you have any book recommendations on that? The idea of new with the idea of conservation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it's in terms of why do we need to remind ourselves and each other that newness serves the interests of marketers, and that disruptive hype serves the interests not of the messages but of the messengers. That's certainly one of the impacts, is that the hot new thing is a commercial strategy, with planned obsolescence being a way of making sure that even if iPhone 17 doesn't really seem that different from 16 or whatever, and I have no idea actually what iPhone is right now. Like, my kids mock me because I have like an iPhone 6 or something ridiculous. But there is, I think, a growing sense that we need to think about the materiality of digital media. And in the first chapter of the book, I talk about the consequences of the sense that information was losing its body, right? and imagined as information itself, which some scholars have traced to the 19th century, that was divorced from any kind of material support or environmental or ecological connection, even when we know how much it depends on. There's a fascinating resource called I believe it's the Atlas of AI by Kate Crawford and Trevor, I forget the name, but that talks about the all of the dependencies of AI in these different contexts, these material contexts, some of which are contemporary, like its dependence on data centers and energy sources, but also which are historical in linking back to the establishment of oceanic fiber optic networks, which retrace the same sea lanes as transoceanic cables that had to be insulated with rubber gutta percha. So the deforestation of South Asia in the 19th century, environmental calamity and massive change, is directly related to the imagination of like a global information network that is somehow divorced from its material reality. Now, I know this is necessarily get to new, but what's called media archaeology, there's a lot of activity about this, as well as the kind of environmental dimensions of media as a direct way of substantiating all that kind of new erases in that ecological context.
And Paul, I actually have a question for you. Can you share a little bit more about it? You were talking about it a little bit just now, but your Oceanic Exchanges project, I guess you were really talking a little bit about that just now. And we had it in the notes, and I know that there's a web page online, but you care to share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that was a project. It's concluded now, but it was a funded project run by a friend of mine, Ryan Cordell, whose work focuses on 19th century U.S. newspapers and is really excellent. And Ryan partnered with a computer scientist to essentially use plagiarism detection software to find where large collections of 19th century U.S. newspapers reprinted stuff, right? And this is another example of the kind of information network that existed at the time that may anticipate ours, that the newspaper is not a site of original writing. What his project really demonstrated is the newspaper is an agglomeration of other texts from other places. And what was called scissors and paste journalism was the order of the day, in that you would subscribe to other newspapers and just pick the stuff you wanted for yours, and your compositor would, set the type and you would run it. Sometimes that would be attributed, sometimes it would just appear, and that was common practice. So Ryan and David Smith, his collaborator, created an algorithm to detect text reuse and identify what they called viral texts. Which is super interesting. It's like what went viral in the 19th century in newspapers. In this case, not social media posts, but little snippets and paragraphs and news items. And they found all sorts of really interesting kind of micro genres that were really popular. But this project, Oceanic Exchanges, was an attempt to say, okay, well, what if we look beyond just the Library of Congress Chronicling America collection of U.S. newspapers, sadly no longer being supported, and instead apply that across different national collections of newspapers, and then really try to even see if we can use it across languages to get a sense of an internationalizing press network and how it worked. So I was involved in that project on a little bit of a few different ways, but it included a case study where we were looking at how news events, international news events, propagated and were reshaped across this network. So yeah, lots of interesting resonances with the present, as well as like lessons for how we think about virality and networks today.
Thank you for sharing that. And to your point, it'd be really interesting to consider Victorian definitions of quote unquote viral. How we measure, virility, So, but thank you for sharing that. And I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. I appreciate you all being here today, and I appreciate your questions. And Murray, I see your message in the Q&A chat now. So again, Paul, just we appreciate you. Again, we're not very, very far away, so I look forward to talking to you more about upcoming projects that you're working on, including prehistory of AI. So I'd love to hear more about that, and I'm sure there'll be opportunities for us to connect and to chat again here soon. To everyone who made it out tonight, it's Friday Eve. So happy Thursday to you. You have made it through the week. And just want to let you all know, if you're interested in hearing more about all the happenings at the National Humanities Center, please follow us at National Humanities or at NHC Education. Support the humanities education programs, if you will. The NHC education programs provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and tools that they and their students need to make a difference. So for those of you all who are already supporting our work, those who are considering it, thanks in advance. And we truly appreciate you. So we will be back next Tuesday with H.W. Brands, Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin, for a session on founding partisans. And so, looking forward to having you all back. If you should have any questions of us, any questions whatsoever, please do not hesitate to reach out to NHC_ed at National Humanities Center, or reach out to me directly at mwilliams@nationalhumanitiescenter.org. Again, we will be back next week. Take care and be well.